Exciting. All right, so we are live. I'm here today with a very special guest, Jumana Yahya. And Jumana, for those that don't know you, could you just say a little bit about who you are and what you're currently doing?
Sure. So right now I am a PhD candidate and researcher with Osnabrück University in Germany. I came from New York. I was basically raised and grew up in New York, and I did my associates there, my bachelor's. I went down to Atlanta to do my master's, and now here I'm doing my PhD. And you could say I'm a philosopher by discipline, but I've been transitioning into the cognitive sciences. So the last few years, been dabbling in psychology and neuroscience, so trying to get a very interdisciplinary approach to my work.
Yeah, very cool. And I think we need more people like that are got one foot in both worlds, so to speak, of philosophy and the cognitive sciences. So I think that's very cool. And you've been working on self-control.
Yes, that's correct.
So, and in particular, I think you're interested in what's called situated cognition. Can you tell us a little bit about what situated cognition is and how it's different from traditional theories of cognitive control?
Absolutely. So situated cognition is a fairly recent idea that's been in development. Basically, the gist is that the mind is not just contained by the cranium, by the skull. The brain is not all there is to the mind, and that the mind also includes other extracranial processes. So things like the body, your environment, and or social circles. So situated cognition has a lot of different niches. People are giving different situated views for different types of theories. So what I'm interested in right now is giving a situated view of self-control, meaning we look at self-control not just as a cognitive ability that happens in the brain, but also involves processes outside of the brain.
Yeah, so I mean, this is kind of a broad camp, right? The situated movement, because I think you would include people like Chalmers and Clark, the extended mind kind of people.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you could even say they're the pioneers of these kinds of views. So situated cognition is a very broad umbrella term that includes embodied cognition, extended, embedded, enacted, distributed. So these are just different terms relating to which extracranial process you think is more important. So for example, environment for the extended people, the body for the embodied people, and also the relationship that the brain has to these other processes. So whether they're two constituents of the same system or whether there's a causal relation. But generally speaking, anytime you give causal credit to anything outside of the brain for any kind of cognitive process, you're in the situated camp.
So it's that broad. It's so, that's interesting. It's just causal credit to something external, so it's not the claim that the external thing is literally a part of the mind or constitutes the cognitive process. That's
sometimes important. Sometimes that would depend on the view itself. So sometimes they're constituents of the same system, but different theorists have different ideas on what they think that relationship is.
Yeah. So if it's just cause. I mean, this is something that I really don't know a lot about. That's never stopped a philosopher from saying something about it.
Of course not.
But so I'm just asking a clarificatory question right now. But if it's just something that's causally impacting you, then it seems like every theory turns into a situated theory, right? Because even like theories of perception, obviously the external environment, stimuli there causally impact you, producing internal representation, so to speak. So that wouldn't be a situated theory though, right?
So yes and no. It depends on what kind of causal relationship you're really pointing at. So if it's merely an influential cause or a contributory cause, that might not be enough to be considered a bona fide situated view. But if you give a necessary causal role to these external processes, then yes, you're absolutely going in the situated view. And it's actually interesting that you mentioned perception because some of the most popular situated views and some of the most foundational ones start off in perception, talking about. So I believe Gibson is one of the big names in this sort of field. So perception theory and actually also theories of emotion have very much adopted the situated view to where almost all the theories in these fields have some sort of situated aspect to it.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. And then just another kind of clarificatory question about what the situated movement is. So you were very careful when you said that these are processes that are extracranial,
Yeah.
thereby defining brain as what's in the cranium.
Mhm.
And I wonder what you might say to someone who wanted to suggest that that was too limited of a notion of what the brain is. So the brain is extended through the body, sort of by definition. The spinal cord and the nerves innervating every muscle and so forth and so on. So that doesn't count as part of the brain on the view that you are endorsing. Is that correct?
So it absolutely could. And I think that's the whole idea of the situated movement, is to kind of get people to start being more comfortable with understanding the brain as something that's not just inside your skull, that it also includes the nerves that extend out to it. It also includes the hormonal balances that go on internally, the sense perception that comes out externally. So that all channels into the brain. So we can't say that the brain is only the brain. Yes, of course, the spinal cord is part of it. The rest of the body is part of it. And arguably, even environment and society can also become part of it as well.
Okay, yeah, good. All right. And then sort of one last thing about this, sort of more philosophically, you would count even views like called externalism in philosophy as part of the situated movement, so that the idea of the meaning of terms depends on the environment that you're in. So famously, if you know about Putnam and twin earth and twin water and all those kinds of things, that would also, any kind of externalism then would about mental content would also count as situated?
Yes, I would think so. And even perhaps certain views of moral externalism can even be given a situated label.
Yeah, so given the broad camp, it's hard to see how anyone would be against it. But I know that there are
Yes.
people. So
Yes, and there are also extreme versions of the view where people really give very little credit to the brain and say it's all about the environment, it's all about the society. So these more extreme views definitely open themselves up to criticism.
yeah, okay. So then, talking specifically about what you're working on now, so that's the self-control kind
Yes.
of project. So there, I mean, I get the sense from reading your stuff that the dominant view is a kind of cognitivism, and you want to kind of switch the paradigm or get people to be more interested in situated theories of cognitive control. Excuse me, of self-control. So the only work that I'm really familiar with that you talk about is Alfred Mealy's work, and some of the other stuff I'm only passingly familiar with. So can you tell us what cognitive theories of self-control are before we start criticizing them?
Yes, absolutely. So you're right to say that the majority of the self-control literature is predominantly cognitivist. So for them, self-control is a mental ability, but more specifically, it's a mental ability that's located in the brain. The majority of self-control theorists even take another step further and say self-control is not just localized in the brain, but it's localized in a very small specific portion of the brain. That's the prefrontal cortex. Now, I find philosophers of self-control to be a little more lenient towards looking outside of the brain. So Alfred Mealy, for example, makes a claim in one of his books that his view is holistic, meaning he's not just worried about these executive functions, as they're called in psychology, but self-control also extends and includes things like emotions, subconscious perceptions. However, the psychologists are very, very, very much into this idea of the prefrontal cortex, that self-control is specifically the ability to inhibit emotional impulses, and they localize in this very one small portion and they concentrate completely on that. One of the biggest problems that I see in that is these psychological theories are what underline therapies and therapeutic designs. So when people struggle with impulse control disorder, they go to therapy, and the thing that they hear all the time is, oh, you need to start thinking the right sorts of thoughts. You need to calm yourself down, think these cool, deliberate thoughts. And they spend years going to therapy sessions with these therapists, learning how to think these cool, calm thoughts. But it ends up being very ineffective. I mean, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is based on this idea that self-control is this inhibitory capacity in the front of the brain, it's a very ineffective form of therapy. for every person with impulse control disorder that goes through rehabilitation, they have a 60% chance of relapse. Wow. For their first time, which is, I think, very, very bad statistics. A lot of people end up dropping out of rehabilitation clinics before they could finish their course, or maybe even years later, the problem comes back. So it just seems to me that it's essentially just ineffective working on these sorts of skills that people have a hard time accessing to begin with. And that's why I think at least psychology, the field of psychology, would really benefit taking other things into consideration. And there has been slight movements here and there, like the cognitive bias movement, bringing attention to the fact that people can't really fight cognitive biases, at least not all of them. But it's a very, very slow progression getting to where we need to be with these sorts of views.
Right. So, and the focus on the prefrontal cortex, I mean, it's largely the result of empirical data, right? When you, or would you suggest that it is? Like, for instance, I mean, the famous case of Phineas Gage is the sort of textbook example of a person who loses self-control after damage to the prefrontal cortex. You hear all the time about, you know, underdeveloped prefrontal cortex and people under the age of 25 being somehow responsible for impulsive behaviors and stuff like that. So what would be your response to those kinds of empirical data points as sources of evidence for the cognitive view?
So I'm not looking to deny any of that empirical evidence. I do believe that the prefrontal cortex is a very important player in self-control. Where my view differs is that I don't think it's the only important player. I think that there are other members of the self-control system that could also help out. And yes, maybe in a perfectly functioning, normal human adult who has pretty decent activity in the prefrontal cortex and everything is going well and smooth, maybe for these individuals, these classic kind of cognitive behavioral therapies would be effective and would be helpful. But I'm more interested in helping the individuals that don't have access to these abilities. So the people with either physical deficiencies, some sort of maybe bonk on the head or something of that sort that knocked it out, the kids under the age of 25, or even adults that are generally very self-controlled but have one source of weakness that they just can't fight. So that's where I think the situated views become very, very helpful, is finding what I call cognitive shortcuts. So ways to get the relevant behavior without having to utilize the sorts of abilities that these individuals can't access, that they just can't tap into for whatever reasons.
Right. Okay. So that's very interesting. So the view that you want to develop then is that while the prefrontal cortex is important, it's not the only important thing. So focusing solely on that is kind of missing a bunch of other factors.
Exactly, exactly. So one of the things that I'm trying to do with my work is to shift looking at self-control as a single cognitive ability to understanding self-control as a system that has several interacting members, the prefrontal cortex being only one of those members. Another important member is the emotional system. So for example, there was this wonderful study done by Southcheck and colleagues, I believe in 2016, where they suspended activity in the temporal parietal junction. And then they had people delay their gratification. So wait for a larger reward that's in the future as opposed to indulging in the sooner reward, smaller reward. And what they found is every time they suspended activity in this one brain area, people became really bad at delaying their gratification. And one of the conclusions that the authors made from this is that the temporal parietal junction, one of its functions is empathy, cognitive empathy. So what they're doing in suspending activities, they're suspending cognitive empathy, and that's what makes the individual bad at delaying their gratification. So essentially what happens is they don't empathize with their future selves. So they're now willing to sacrifice their gratification now in lieu of satisfying their future self. So there, right there, we have empirical evidence for emotions being very important in this ability. And I mean, not to give things away too quick, but I think the body is also incredibly important in this self-control system. There's also been a plethora of evidence for environmental and social factors being very important for self-control. So, for example, the self-determination theory by Ryan and Deci. It's a great article where they canvass so many different empirical studies that time and time again show that internal motivation is best fostered when you have the right social circles and when you have the right environment.
Yeah, so I think that's very interesting. I wonder what you would say about recent criticisms of some of these kinds of social kinds of work. So, you know, the Stanford prison experiments come under great scrutiny recently with some release of tapes suggesting that Zimbardo was coaching the bad actors, in particular the prison guards, the ones assigned there, so that, also the marshmallow test, the famous marshmallow test, has come under kind of recent criticism, suggesting that if you control for class and wealth, that the effect disappears, in effect suggesting that those who can delay self-gratification can do so because they're not worried about the future source of food and resources, whereas people who eat the marshmallow right away are not lacking in willpower necessarily, but may just be worried about not getting something later because of their socioeconomic class. And there's other, so social psychology in general is kind of facing this replication crisis. And since you're putting a lot of emphasis on these kinds of results, I wonder what you think about this kind of criticism.
Yes. I tend to agree with a lot of it. So, for example, one of my biggest criticisms about the marshmallow experiments is that, yes, okay, maybe kids will do well in delaying their gratification when they're sitting in the test room and there's an adult experimenter. And in many versions, they actually coach the kids. They ask them leading questions to get them to think the right sorts of cool thoughts that gets the relevant behavior. I absolutely agree there is this problem in social psychology. I myself, as a student learning about all these, that was always my number one criticism, is how can you really test for these human-like behaviors in this very constricted sort of way? On the one hand, you're taking the people out of the real world, and whatever results we get from that, I'm not really interested in it. And on the other hand, these are people testing people with their own hypotheses that they're trying to show. So subconsciously, they might do certain things to manipulate the experimental paradigm to get the sorts of results that they want. So I never take what these results say to heart. I never take it as solid fact. I think it gives us glimpses into human behavior. And one of the things I like to do whenever these criticisms come out is I start to look at the different kinds of experiments, how they're criticized, and see maybe what those sorts of insights are that do tap into actual human beings and maybe where they went wrong. So, for example, to give a concrete example, there's this study by Carney and colleagues about body posture. And this is a study I cite very often in my own work. One of the things that they showed is that taking on a power pose reduces cortisol, so it reduces the stress hormone, versus taking a very slumped pose increases cortisol. And this just kind of, their conclusion was that when you have these power poses, you feel more confident, you're more positive, you're more likely to behave in the ways that you want to behave. And they've recently come under fire for cherry picking their data. So they were saying that in certain power poses, they found no significant difference, and other poses, they found a difference, and they just took the information that gave them those significant results and kind of left out the rest. And one of the biggest defenses that I give towards this theory is, or towards this experiment, is saying that they were just looking at the wrong sort of thing. They were looking just at the poses and what kind of effect it has on the cortisol, but not taking into consideration whether the people were actually putting an effort into the pose. So I could sit up straight without thinking about it, or I could take on a prideful pose where all my muscles are going into that contraction. I could, again, same line of thought, I could sit up straight, but all my muscles be loose, versus sitting up straight with my muscles being contracted. And I think that's where they were forced to cherry pick the data. I think the power poses that didn't get any significant results were individuals that weren't really following through with it. So from here, now I could spin the story and say, look, yes, the information that they get, it's probably the people that were actually interested in participating with this activity, the participants that were into the actual paradigm. So from there, even though, again, it's come under this criticism of cherry picking, even still, I think there's still some insight to be had from that. But with all that said, I do think that social psychology has a very long way to go. And I think one of the answers is interdisciplinary cooperation among different people. So on each experiment, have a neuroscientist, a psychologist, and a philosopher collaborating together. I think that's the future of social psychology. I think that's one of the ways that they could get better.
Well, it's certainly something I agree with. It's nice to that people actually doing cognitive science are thinking the same thing. Of course, you're a bit special given your background in philosophy, so I think that that's an important point that more people should take to heart. While you were talking, though, something just occurred to me. So if the difference between these power poses, and I'm apparently I never am in a power pose, but if the difference that is between those who are really effortfully doing it versus those who aren't doing it, does this suggest that there's some kind of cognitive process? So they're thinking the right thoughts or something as well, right? They're thinking, I'm powerful. This is, putting. So I wonder if that situatedness of it and maybe doesn't support some kind of cognitive misinterpretation.
Yes, so I absolutely agree with you that there is obviously this cognitive process also happening at the same time. And I think that's probably one of the biggest flaws in this particular experiment is the fact that they didn't take that into consideration. This was strictly a behaviorist experiment. So they were just looking to see whether the power pose graded the relevant behavior or not without taking consideration into what happens in between. And when it comes to things like motivation, behavior, self-control, one of the things that is very clear from the empirical literature is that the right sorts of thoughts do matter. The right sorts of perceptions do matter. If you perceive your resources being limited versus unlimited, that will really depend on whether you keep persevering at a task or whether you quit early. So the thoughts absolutely do matter, and they should have taken that into consideration. I think if that was a manipulation check that they would have had, they might have found better results with it. But one thing that I do want to kind of emphasize and make clear with the situated sort of views. Again, as I said before, they don't throw out the right sorts of thoughts. They don't throw out what goes on in the mind. That's still a very, very important player. And that's the whole task at hand for situated views, is to show that the mind matters just as much as these other kinds of factors. So it's really at least a two-player endeavor versus looking at just the mind or looking at just the body.
Right. Okay. So yeah, that's an important point. It's not that you're trying to say that one matters more than the other. Actually, the view is that they matter equally.
Exactly. So I presented this idea of a situated self-control view at a conference in Argentina last year. And one of the questions that I received is, how is this different from regressing back to behaviorism? And really that question is what made me realize that this needs to be emphasized, that situated cognition is not regressing to behaviorism. We're not saying that the mind doesn't matter, so we need to look at only the body or environment or society. Rather that, at least in the self-control literature, we spend so much time looking at the mind already. We spend so much time looking at the right sorts of thoughts at the prefrontal cortex. Now it's time to look at these other players and see how they relate to the mind.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I guess one of the, just backing up a bit, we haven't really, I guess, specified what we mean by self-control. So
yes.
I wonder if we could just say, what is it? What is the target phenomenon? Is it, it's not just simply like getting up and going to get food when you're hungry. It's something more specific, like defeating temptation or something, or is it both of these? Or?
Yes. So self-control, very generally speaking, is an instance where an agent sticks to their better judgment. So first and foremost, they have to have a better judgment. They have to have some sort of goal in mind. I ought to do X. I assume a better judgment to be a sincere, all things considered better judgment. So kind of excluding second order desires, meaning when I say I want to go on a diet, that's my better judgment. I genuinely desire to go on a diet for whatever reasons I have. So anytime you act on that better judgment, it counts as self-control. But the self-control literature makes a distinction between two types of self-control, diachronic and synchronic. Most self-control theorists, myself included, are interested in the synchronic kind. So synchronic self-control occurs when you act on your better judgment when there's some sort of motivational opposition to that behavior. The classic example of motivational opposition is temptation. I'm on a diet, but I'm tempted by a slice of chocolate cake. Other forms of motivational opposition include procrastination, so delaying acting on your better judgment, but also cases of diminished motivation. So examples of extreme depression or apathy, lethargy, when you just simply don't have the desire, motivational resources to do anything. So anytime your better judgment faces this kind of challenge and you overcome the challenge and act on it anyway, that's an instance of synchronic self-control.
So I'm curious about the notion of all things considered best judgment. Mm-hmm. Is this something that's subjective to the agent, or do you mean that it's somehow objective, like, it's what's best for them even if they don't recognize it? Or is the idea supposed to be that they have to recognize that this is something that's in their best interest?
So philosophers debate about this back and forth. For me, for my purposes, I take a very, very simple notion of in all things considered sincere judgment. I mean, purely subjective. Whatever the agent wants to do, judges is best for her. And importantly, realizes that anything else would be the worst option.
Okay, so then, I mean, I'm curious about cases where, in extreme apathy, being from Generation X and all of that, something I sympathize with. But in cases of extreme lethargy or apathy, isn't it not the case that at least in sometimes these kinds of persons don't have a best things, all things considered best judgment? So, I want to lay on the couch all day. There's no part of me that wants to get up and complete the research project. So in that kind of case, self-control isn't possible on your view, or how do you deal with these kinds of cases where there isn't a conflict?
Yeah, so I would say that wouldn't count as a case of self-control, or in this situation, weakness of will. I wouldn't count that because the agent is essentially doing what the agent wants to do. The real cases I'm interested in is this cognitive dissonance that occurs when you wholeheartedly want and believe that X is the right and best and most desirable action for you, but there's just this Y being so tempting that you also want to indulge in. And it's this kind of war that happens inside the agent's head between wanting to go two separate incompatible ways.
Right. So, okay. So in the other case, so those other cases are just simply not covered by the kind of theory that you're interested in proposing.
No.
So I wonder if we could extend this to, cases of moral judgments. For instance, Kant famously suggested that a kind of cognitive dissonance, but not in those words, but a kind of conflict between what you want and what you judge you ought to do in terms of moral duties, that there being a conflict between them is a kind of reliable guide, not the only indicator, but a reliable guide, that there's something morally here involved. So does your kind of view also extend to cases where, I really want to watch the season finale of The Bachelorette, but I also feel duty bound to go and pick up, someone from the airport who I promised to, or whatever. So in those kinds of cases, that's not temptation that's involved, unless it's the other way. The temptation is to do something that you want to do, but you override it, or at least one hopes that you can override it in the case of trying to do what you think is right. So that's still a case of that you're interested in trying to account for, or no?
Yes, absolutely. I think everything that I say can be at least in some way extended to moral theory. That's actually where this all started, was from moral theory. So my concentration used to be ethical and moral theories. I was very into Aristotle and Spinoza and all these guys. And it wasn't until I took a moral psychology class, again, being interested in the moral part of it, that I came across a paper on procrastination by Donald Davidson. Mm-hmm. And this was a very random thing. I just read this paper and I was just bewildered by what he was saying. This isn't what I do when I procrastinate, is what I said to myself. So from there kind of launched this interest in weakness of will and self-control and how we could control our own behaviors to be the people that we want to be. But I mean, the moral theory is still very much part and parcel of everything that I have to say. In fact, one of the projects I'm currently working on is to carve out a place for emotions in self-control theory. And one of the emotions that I suggest as a candidate for potentially self-controlling emotion is pride. And one of the arguments I give for why pride should be considered a self-control emotion stems back to Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, where he says that pride is the crown of all the virtues. So I think these are very, very much interrelated concepts, and I do think that you could cross that bridge into moral theory.
Interesting, even though there's no weakness of will there, unless you go the other way towards not doing what the moral thing would be or something.
Yes, exactly. As long as there's two incompatible options and you want to do both of them, that for me is a stage for self-control or weakness of will, depending how it plays out. But those are the kinds of cases I'm interested in.
Okay, cool. So now can we talk, I want to talk about your specific views, which we've kind of mentioned a couple of times, but haven't really delved into. So it's particularly the role that emotions play. And I'm guessing from what you're saying that the emotions are, on your view, embodied and not something that are cognitive. So can you tell us, well, first of all, how you use the term emotion? What is it that you're picking out when you say emotion?
Yeah. So I use this term very, very broadly. For me personally, my own intuition is that you cannot pick out a single instance of any cognitive occurrence without it being emotional or affective in some way or another. So for me, I mean a very, very broad sort of category. Anything that has to do with physical sensations, feelings, but also subconscious thought occurrences. I'm very, very broad in the way I use it. I mean, when I write about emotions, I take into account basic emotions theories and stuff like psychological constructivism, which are kind of at odds. And I try to present the definition of emotions where both camps would be satisfied with it. But generally speaking, the way it fits into my view, what I'm attempting to do right now is develop an embodied view of self-control. So for me, as a situated theorist, out of the three, body, environment, or society, I think that the body is the easiest source to tap into whenever you're going through cognitive dissonance in the moment. So you're on a diet, there's a slice of chocolate cake in front of you, your body is your best bet. And I'm trying to weave a story, if you will, of how coordinated motor movements in the body creates the right sorts of thoughts, the relevant sort of self-controlling thoughts that gets the right behavior. And on my view, emotions is the bridge between this coordinated physical motion and the relevant self-controlling thoughts. So on one hand, there's already, like I mentioned before, a whole ton of research showing that there are relevant self-controlling thoughts that have to do with a sense of agency, a sense of competence, strength, resilience, endurance, these kinds of judgments about the self. On the other hand, there are very few, admittedly, but there are some empirical studies that show the body's role in self-control. The most prominent is a study by Hung and LeBrew, where they showed that clenching your fist can help firm your willpower. There's another great study by Smith and Woods that shows students who chew gum for 2 weeks got more academic work done. There's another study with kids that found that the kids that move around a lot during the day, that movement is a better predictor of their academic performance than any sort of cognitive tasks or tests that they could do. So on the one hand, we have the evidence that the body somehow helps foster relevant self-control. We have the evidence of what the self-controlling things are. And I think that what happens is when we move in a coordinated sort of fashion, what it does is it invokes a sense of pride in us. It makes us realize that we are in charge of our own bodies, in charge of our own movements. And that pride creates that thoughts of agency and confidence and endurance and strength and all of that, equaling out in the relevant behavior at the end of it.
So on your view, then, the emotions are always conscious, or can they occur unconsciously?
On my view, they are predominantly subconscious, I would say.
So yeah. Predominantly subconscious. That means occasionally conscious?
Occasionally conscious, yes. I think people, especially those that take the time and care about developing their self-control and becoming better, they pay more attention to the sorts of feelings and emotions that they have. So they're more consciously aware of what's going on and how that factors in. But I think more often than not, when it comes to everyday occurrences of self-control, that these emotions occur subconsciously, and we might not realize that it's the feeling that's motivating us as opposed to the cool, deliberate kinds of thoughts that we're thinking.
So on your view, then this might explain why some theorists kind of just focus on the cool thoughts, because they're missing the subconscious contributions. And just exactly. The thoughts themselves are conscious, though, right?
Yes, exactly. So, for example, one of the views that kind of touches upon this idea is Kenneth and Smith, Frog and Toad Lose Control. This is a very popular piece in the self-control literature. And according to Kenneth and Smith, self-control cannot happen by getting yourself to think the right sorts of cool, deliberate thoughts. Why? Because your attention is focused on this object of temptation, on this cookie, and you can't tear yourself away from it. You're motivated to do that. So how can you muster the motivation to get yourself to think the right sorts of thoughts, not to eat the cookie? They say your only hope in avoiding and eating that cookie is if you train your disposition to be the kind that reflexively and subconsciously thinks the right sorts of thoughts or gets the right sorts of images. And that's your only hope. So if you see the cookie and you just spontaneously, unmotivatedly start thinking about yourself as very overweight, or maybe if you took out all the sugar out of that cookie and laid it into a pile. So these are the sorts of images that motivate you to stay away from the cookie, not you sitting there telling yourself, don't eat the cookie, don't eat the cookie, don't focus on the cookie. They think that's not even an option. So that's very much an intuition that my work tests with. Right? There you go. See, subconscious inclinations.
But sorry to interrupt. Finish your thought. Sorry.
No, I was just saying that's absolutely the kind of intuition that I like to tap into. I think the subconscious is a wonderful, wonderful tool that we have at our disposal if we could just figure out how to tap into it whenever we need to. People subconsciously can do very amazing things. So, for example, one of my favorite researchers is V.S. Ramachandran from San Diego, University of San Diego, and a lot of his work is focused on these sort of subconscious processes. So he works with blind sight patients, people that are blind, are not able to see, but are able to stick a letter into a very thin slot in a white wall right in front of them with almost perfect accuracy. So it's these subconscious sort of processes that allow them to do it. Because if you ask the individual, can you do this? They say, of course not, I'm blind. I can't see the slot. I can't even see the shape of the letter. Yet somehow they're able to do it. Anytime I study a lot of people embarking in physical sports activities, UFC fighters, martial artists, even snowboarders and skiers. I find these to be very self-controlled individuals. And time and time again, the thing that they keep telling me is that for me to succeed, I need to turn my mind off. I need to stop thinking about it, and I just need to kind of feel it. So that's the kind of intuition that I'm trying to develop into a theory of what I think would be more effective and more efficient self-control.
So that's the kind of literature on flow. Is that the sort of thing
Yes,
you're talking?
yes, absolutely. So kind of tapping into a state of flow and just being able to power through those temptations, power through that diminished motivation. Actually, one of my papers is titled "Fighting Fire with Firo," and Firo is a specific version of pride. And the idea there is when you have these very hot, vivid, arousing temptations, it's going to be so insanely difficult for you to sit there and think the right sorts of thoughts to get the right sort of behavior. Why not motivate yourself just as vividly, just as passionately to push through that temptation instead of slowly convincing yourself to avoid it?
So the embodied part or the situated part of your view doesn't seem to, or I'm wondering if I'm misunderstanding you. So is it the case that on your view, the embodied situated aspect of the theory isn't the emotion part, or is it? So because you were saying on the one hand, there's the bodily activity, then there's the emotion, the thought, and in between is the emotion. So I'm wondering on your view, what side the emotion is. Is it, are you like going for a James kind of theory, a William James, where the emotions are physical responses in the body, or something else where the emotions are either basic or cognitive constructed, or are you trying to bridge that gap in a different way?
Yeah, so I'm trying to more or less stay agnostic on exactly what I mean by an emotion. So whether it's this feeling-based thing, whether they're socially constructed, intuitively, if you just ask me what I think an emotion is, I'm going to put a lot of emphasis on the body, the physical changes, the facial expressions. I think these are all very important. The internal hormonal changes and chemical changes that you have, I think those are very important. If I had to choose one feature of an emotion where I say this is the most important, I would go with the motivation aspect of it, that emotions are there to motivate us. But how it fits into my view is essentially it's just one more player in the system. Right now in the development part, it's a kind of a flow chart I have where it's body leading into emotion, leading into the right sorts of thoughts. But I have a feeling eventually as I continue developing this view, it's going to become more of a circle that kind of feeds into itself, where these are all, yes, they're all separate members, but they're interacting with each other in these very complex and dynamic ways.
Okay, yeah, all right. Well, I don't want to get too distracted because I'm easily distracted by this stuff. But so I wonder how we could empirically test your view as opposed to some of these other views. And I mean, I know you're working on some stuff now. You can't really maybe tell me the details because you're still in the designing process. But I just wonder if you could say something in general about how some of these ideas could be empirically tested.
Absolutely. So for empirical test, unfortunately, this idea is very, very, very new, combining situated cognition with self-control. In fact, as of right now, as far as I'm aware of, there's only 4 papers that talk about situated self-control in some way or another. So we're kind of starting off from scratch, from a very blank sort of slate. So the first step in testing these sorts of ideas is looking at just the behavioral kinds of aspects to see if the coordinated motor movement will get us the relevant sort of behavior. So that's going to be the first step, and that's kind of what we're working towards in our empirical study now, which we're going to be launching in the fall, just to see what relation the body has with specifically perseverance, right? So continuing to undertake a challenge, even though it's very challenging and you have the temptation to give up. It's a little harder figuring out how to test for emotions within that. But luckily, I work with some incredibly bright minds from all sorts of different fields or sorts of different disciplines. So I have a really great group that I'm brainstorming with right now to see how we could plug in emotions into that. But essentially, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going towards these, we're testing for these behaviors by manipulating emotional expressions in the body. So it's kind of the facial feedback hypothesis, but extended to the whole body. So this idea that when you're happy, you smile, but also if you smile, you get happy. That same thing applied to the whole body. So taking on, say, the body posture of pride, right? Where you have the shoulders back, the clenched fist, the furrowed eyebrows, but the big grin at the same time. So to see these physical, emotional expressions, if they change the behavior that we're looking for. So that's going to be the first steps into going into this.
Do you think it would matter whether the facial body postures were the subject's own as opposed to someone else's? So if I see a picture of someone in a prideful position as opposed to a picture of myself in a prideful position, do you think that that's going to matter at all?
Well, I think it will have some sort of differences, but one of the things that researchers have found, specifically Tracy and Matsumoto, did this great study with Olympians in the Paralympics. So these were competing Olympians who were blind. And one of the things that they found is their pride postures very, very much resemble the spontaneous pride postures of seeing individuals. And these were congenitally blind individuals. These are people that are blind their entire life. So there was no way that they had the visual imprint of somebody else performing this. So there's at least some evidence that the expression of at least pride is innate and universal. Most people really express it in very, very similar ways. They hit on the same kinds of behavioral markers. So in that sense, it won't matter too much because I'm expecting most people, even spontaneously, to kind of fall into more or less similar positions. It might be a little tricky with other emotions, ones that maybe don't have this more or less universal innate sort of expression. But luckily, those emotions are not on the table for now. We're dealing with a fairly easy one.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I agree with you that some of these things are kind of have stereotypical expressions. But I guess my question was about whether you think that seeing that the same expression in a different individual is going to have the same effect on me that it would be seeing myself that way. So I wonder if it's more motivation, if it's somehow more you know, if you become happier if you see a picture of yourself smiling as opposed to someone else smiling, or is that you don't expect that kind of effect at all?
Yes, actually, that's a good point. So I think there would be a difference in effect if, say, you were observing somebody that looked very different from you. You know, smiling versus looking at somebody that looks very similar, or even yourself smiling. So this just reminds me of another really cool study that they're doing at Stanford University with avatars. So they have people sitting there and just watching an avatar walking on a treadmill for a few minutes. And the avatars either look exactly like the participant or they look very different from the participant. And then the participants go home the next day. The researchers call them up and just ask them casually, what did you do, you know, today throughout your day? Take me through your activities. And what they found is the people that watch the avatars that look like them spontaneously worked out the next day, as opposed to people that watched avatars that look nothing like them, didn't spontaneously work out the next day. So I think there is something to this idea where seeing yourself smiling or somebody that looks like you smiling is going to maybe make you more comfortable with smile, more likely to spontaneously smile yourself than watching somebody else. But these are the sort of things that we're trying to account for, at least in our empirical design. So one of the things we have to do is give them a kind of trigger video to have them follow along with the expressions, the physical expressions. And we have several different videos with different people in it, so that we could show people videos of people that look more like them. So for women, it would be women in the video. For men, it would be men. And we try to see if we could discriminate so they look similar to each other.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. And then so what is the general idea supposed to be that by engaging in these kinds of activities, the processes become more automated? So therefore, the barriers fall down or something? Is that the general idea?
Yes, yes. So one of the most popular terms in situated literature is this idea of offloading. So you offload your cognitive sorts of problems or dilemmas or tasks or anything you need to do onto the environment or somewhere else. So one of the prime examples is Otto's notebook. Otto has this notebook. He can't remember where the Museum of Modern Art is, so he writes down in his notebook, and that becomes part of his mind because he's offloading that memory on there. So this is the same sort of concept. Whenever you're struggling with overcoming temptation or diminished motivation or anything of that sort, and you feel yourself weakening, you feel that you can't do it, offload that strength, that endurance, that autonomy onto your body instead of just keeping it in your mind, and have the body kind of create these vivid, passionate motivations to be able to overcome that.
Yeah, so the Otto's notebook, of course, that's from Clark and Chalmers there. It was important for that example that he sort of automatically and reliably referred to the notebook. So just writing something down in the notebook on their view isn't the same as having the only way that you could perform the action go through the notebook. Does that kind of difference matter for you as well, as for the offloading that you're talking about?
So yes, I'm willing to go that far, but specifically for these kinds of situations where people are lacking the relevant self-control skills. So in the more extreme examples of people that really struggle with chronic motivational opposition, so people that are weak-willed to begin with and are trying to find a way to build up that self-control, I would absolutely be willing to go as far as to say that they're literally incapable of using the traditional self-control strategies in that sense. So for these individuals to have any sort of success, they need to offload that self-control onto their bodies. I think it's the only effective strategy that they could use.
And by offloading it to the body, what you mean is by developing certain actions which promote the emotional response that then lead to the cognitive response.
Exactly. Exactly. So to make you tap into this, you mentioned the word flow before. So to tap into the state of flow where you're just automatically, subconsciously doing what you need to do to get through that temptation.
It's interesting. I see a lot of connections to Aristotelian ethical theory coming away. You're saying that there's a kind of habit, habitus, or whatever the Aristotelian term would be, that the virtuous person who's in control does it automatically to a point where it becomes second nature. And it's really the kind of akrasia or weakness of will that you seem to be interested in seems to sort of break down exactly where Aristotle would have predicted, where there's a kind of cognitive understanding of what the right course of action is, but not the correct habits, not the correct dispositions to follow through, or the skill, in, I guess, as he would put it. So do you see a connection to those kinds of concepts?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, Aristotle, not just in my work, but in my life, has been insanely inspirational. Also, a very similar kind of theorist, Benedict Spinoza. So he's also very, very similar to Aristotle in the kinds of claims that he makes and the kind of worldview that he has. So he's very, very influential in the way I kind of think about these things as well. But yes, absolutely. It's all about this idea of creating the right sorts of dispositions, the right sorts of habits, and an idea that it's a very, very undeveloped idea at the moment, but it's something that I'm starting to think about, is finding the source of weakness of will. So what puts people into this situation to begin with where they need self-control? So it's a matter of cognitive dissonance, right? Like I said before, you judge X is the best thing to do, but you also really want to do Y. And I think that the reason why people come to these places, or at least the more extreme, chronic, motivational opposition sorts of situations, is because these are the kinds of people that their lives are very separated, are very distinct into different categories. So there's this division of selves, right? But not necessarily a division of present self versus future self, but a division between current self as you are and the ideal self that you want to be. right? So the farther the ideal self is from your current self, the harder it is to act the way your ideal self would act, because these are two very separate things in your perception. Very similar, people that go into a grocery store and they divide everything in the grocery store between healthy and tasty, right? So carrots, they're more healthy than they are tasty, so they must be healthy. Cupcakes are tasty. So when they make these sorts of divisions, people look in their baskets that's filled with carrots and cucumbers and tomatoes, and they start feeling very depressed. There's like, where's the tasty stuff? Where's the chocolate muffins and the cupcakes? And I think that definitely promotes weakness as well. Seeing just the world as, you know, either things are going your way or terrible things are always happening to you. So I think the more that people perceive the world in these very harsh sorts of distinctions, the more vulnerable they leave themselves to be weak-willed, right? Because now it becomes a struggle. You're like, here's what I want and here's what I have to begrudgingly do. Versus people that don't make these harsh distinctions in the world. They kind of see the world as this unified, interplaying sort of network. I think those are the people that are more likely to look at a carrot and say, a carrot could be both healthy and tasty, right? And these are the people that are more likely to stick to diets or to get their term papers done on time or anything of that sort. So one of the goals that I have in this project is kind of seeing how we could unify everything again together instead of making these distinctions, which again is one of the reasons why I don't like to focus so much on the prefrontal cortex, because there we're making divisions within the brain. Here's the good, slow, deliberate part of the brain and the evil, vivid, impulsive part of the brain. And I think that's where people get into a lot of hot water. And kind of getting away from these harsh divisions, and again having this more holistic kind of perspective feeds the motivation, it feeds the self-control. And I think that's something that Aristotle is really trying to point at, right? It's not that you're always either good or bad, right? Sometimes you try to do the good thing and you mess up, right? So you're neither good nor you're bad, but you learn from your mistakes and you keep going and you keep getting better and better. So that's absolutely the kinds of intuitions that are guiding this kind of project.
Yeah, I think that's very important too. Like, for instance, you take a typical student who divides the world into things I'm good at versus things I'm terrible at. You know, like for instance, you know, this is a struggle. A lot of students struggle with math. They just think, well, I'm just not good at math. And so, of course, it's no surprise that when it comes time to study for their math exam, they find themselves tempted by the new Xbox game or by the party down the street or by just watching a series of television shows. But of course, what they're missing is that you only become good at math by doing it a lot. So the fact that they've sort of already pre-divided it has set them up to really not have the right kind of motivational states.
Absolutely. I mean, just anecdotally speaking on that same idea, I always joke around that there's a reason why I became a philosophy major, because I hate math. I was good at certain parts of math, but then there are certain things that get me very, very confused about it. I guess as a philosopher, I don't like having only one right answer. That's kind of very weird to me. And for the longest time, I kept avoiding it. I said, no, math is not for me. I'm just going to stay away from it, until I took a formal logic class. And I realized that philosophy is nothing but math, except with statements as the variables instead of numbers as the variables. And once I realized that, and again, this is going with the fact that I loved logic and I very much enjoyed doing proofs and derivations and things of that sort. Once I realized that, I started becoming very, very interested in harder math. So like more experienced algebra, where they're talking about relations between numbers and things like that. And there was a period of my life where I was actually very, very interested in those kinds of things. And everybody around me was shocked. They're like, Jumana doing math? This is crazy. But I mean, it just goes to show you, here was this harsh distinction, math versus philosophy. Once I realized these two things go hand in hand, I'm no longer scared at the idea of doing math. I'm no longer intimidated by it. Same thing with psychology and neuroscience. When I first took my first neuroscience class, I was so horrified and so nervous. I'm like, how am I going to understand this? It's a completely different world. And when I realized that the neuroscientists do the same thing that the philosophers do, it's just the content is different, then I started getting a lot more comfortable with it. I started doing much better in the classes themselves. I started being more motivated to learn these kinds of things. So I think people that make these harsh distinctions, they're setting themselves up to be very vulnerable to weakness of will. The people that see the world in a more holistic kind of way, the hippies of the world, if you will, these are the type of individuals that don't sit there regretting doing the wrong action, more often than not. They're, I think, more likely to act on these better judgments.
I think that's interesting that you come to the conclusion that the hippies are the more self-controlled of us.
Yes. Well, I always have very weird sorts of ideas of what self-controlled individuals are. So, for example, video gamers to me are incredibly self-controlled, very self-motivated individuals. I mean, I've seen people sacrifice so much for the sake of winning a video game as, opposed to anything else in their everyday life. So I actually very much commend individuals like that. But I think an important point to be made here also is the fact that we really need to expand what we mean by self-control, the notions of weakness of will and things like that. It's not just you sitting there telling yourself, don't eat the cookie, and then you don't eat the cookie. That's not the only instance of self-control. People can get very clever when they're being self-controlled. So a person that puts a padlock on their fridge to avoid eating the chocolate cake, some people might say that's cheating. I think that's a very clever way to get yourself to act in the right sorts of ways when you know your own weaknesses, when you know what you can and cannot do.
That's the diachronic self-control.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's diachronic self-control. And actually, I mentioned before, there's only 4 or 5 situated self-control articles or views altogether. One of these is by Dr. Tilman Veerkant. So he's got this great paper where he talks about tying to the mast strategies, referring to the story of Odysseus. He tied himself to the mast to avoid the siren song. And there he makes a very, I think, a great argument for functional equivalence of self-control. He essentially says, I don't care how you do it. If the function is the same, then that counts as self-control for me. If you don't eat the chocolate cake because you prevented yourself from eating it versus you don't eat the chocolate cake because it's locked behind the padlock and you gave your neighbor the keys, the function is still the same. You don't eat the cake, you stay on your diet, and that counts for me. And I very much agree with that. I think we need to get a lot more clever with the kinds of self-control strategies that we act upon us, because take it from somebody that has tried these cognitive strategies and failed at them. It's not fun to fail. You really try, you get yourself excited. You're like, yes, I'm going to be the kind of person that wakes up at 5 o'clock in the morning, does an hour of yoga, walks their dogs, has a full breakfast. Maybe that works for one day, maybe 2, if you're lucky 3. And then you revert right back to where you are. But the worst part is you don't just revert, but you get those feelings of guilt, of sadness, of not being able to be accomplished. And I think that demotivates you for pursuing and for continuing. And I think there's a lot of strategies open to us if we just kind of look at this ability or capacity or system, whatever you want to call it, in a kind of different way.
Yeah, interesting. I think that's an important point, especially, I mean, that's like typical New Year's resolution kind of pathway. You resolve something on January and by, April, you're back to doing exactly, if that long, back to doing exactly. And it's cognitively self-defeating because I think part of the kind of view that you're developing here has it that, well, you can develop the good habits, but you can also develop the bad habits so that you can become more likely to be tempted, more likely to give in by developing the wrong kinds of bodily responses which lead to the wrong kinds of emotions, which lead to the wrong kinds of cognitive thoughts. So that
exactly.
so that either way, I mean, it's very important which way you choose to go, because you're either enforcing the good thing or the bad thing. And I think that's an important point that's often overlooked, that you can learn to become more weak-willed.
Yeah, and I think another very interesting thing is the kinds of habits that you have. They're going to be good or bad depending on your environment, on the kind of people around you, where you live. So habits that are considered very good in one place might be very bad in another place. For example, I've developed living in New York. I developed the New Yorker habit of sunglasses, headphones, don't look at anybody, walk in a straight line, don't make any eye contact, don't speak to anybody on the street. And then I moved down to Atlanta for 3 years.
It's not going to work there.
Southern love. No, it was the exact opposite. Strangers look me dead in the eye on the street. Good morning. How are you? Everywhere I went, right? So here's a new habit that I developed, is saying this. So that when I go back to New York, this good habit that was good in Atlanta is no longer good in New York, because good luck saying good morning to a stranger on the streets of New York. You get verbally assaulted instantly. Like, who are you? What do you want? Leave me alone. Do I know you? So, I mean, just goes to show you that, again, we need to be very dynamic, very open-minded, very clever with these sorts of behaviors that we're trying to indoctrinate in ourselves or kill off in ourselves.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And so kind of bringing this full circle back to the brain a little bit, I'm wondering what you think about addiction, and specifically the kind of idea that addiction is a brain disorder, which is, kind of gained, I mean, there's backlash against it, but it's gained a lot of support, I would say. It's certainly the standard neuroscience textbook presentation of what addiction is, hijacking of the motivational system, by these unconscious cognitive processes, which lead you to, desire the cocaine or the heroin or whatever. But that is something that you literally can't defeat, because there's a very powerful unconscious neural architecture, namely the motivational system, which has been overtaken. So does your view extend to this kind of stuff as well? Do you think that can be corrected in the way you're talking about, or is that something separate?
Absolutely. In fact, it not only extends to these kinds of cases, that's my primary focus. So like I said before, I'm very interested in these extreme chronic sort of cases, addiction being one of the paradigm examples of what I'm talking about. So I do a lot of research into different kinds of addictions and impulse control disorders. And but that's precisely the problem here, is that there is this neural architecture problem, this physical problem that's creating this kind of behavior seeking or drug seeking behavior. And one of the studies that I cite very often in my own work in presenting these sorts of problems is a study that found this backdoor pathway, as they call it, to drug processing. So what they found is this backdoor pathway that completely circumvents the prefrontal cortex anytime addicts feel the desire for a particular kind of drug. So they're not consciously aware of this. They engage in the drug-seeking behavior without realizing what's going on, until in many cases that it's too late. And that's exactly the point. How do you expect an individual that has these processes that are not taking any part in the prefrontal cortex, how is the prefrontal cortex supposed to fight that? It's literally impossible in this sort of way. Going back to the idea before, you need to fight fire with fire. If there's some sort of subconscious habits that are creating these behaviors, then perhaps it's subconscious habits that are going to tackle those things as well, right? So teaching yourself to clench your fists every time that this kind of desire comes into you. It's actually very simple to do. You could teach physical expressions through action observation alone. The people don't even need to be doing it anything. So I envision a therapy where we have drug addicts sitting there and watching somebody else every time they're in front of heroin or cocaine or whatever it be. They just clench their fist. They go, ah, and they walk right past it. And eventually they're going to gain that same muscle memory to do those same physical sorts of movements. And if the empirical studies are right and clenching your fist really firms your willpower, then just subconsciously having that muscle memory reflex to clench your fist when the drugs are in front of you might be enough to firm that willpower to get you away from the drug. At the very least, it puts you into a better position than if you wouldn't have done that. That's the kind of idea. And again, I'm always thinking of the drug addict whenever I read a cognitive sort of strategy that's prescribed, right? So one of the most famous prescriptions, the implementation intentions, right? So tell yourself, if this stimuli occurs, then I do this, right? So you create this intention in yourself. Good luck telling a heroin addict of 20 plus years to form these implementation intentions. Like, I look at these people as the ones that they lack the patience to work too long for it. They lack the physical energy, but also mental energy to put in too much work into it. They're feeling a lot of stress, right? Because they realize that they're fighting against this ingrained addiction that they see as a part of themselves. So there's the physical stress involved in there too. And they're in such a situation that even if they're successful in avoiding the drug one time, I doubt they'll be able to avoid it the second time. Their resources will just be so spent, they'll be so exhausted. So I look at the kinds of strategies where I could prescribe the self-control strategy to an old 80-year-old heroin addict, and he's not going to say like, oh, that's, some hippie stuff. I don't have the time or the patience for this. I want it to be very quick, simple, easy cognitive shortcuts to help the addicts get over the little humps while they build up these feelings of agency and confidence and get up to a level, a threshold where they can start tapping back into these kinds of cognitive prefrontal abilities and eventually becoming a strong, self-controlled individual.
Yeah, I think that's important work. It certainly has many applications. I wonder, sort of more generally, what connection, if at all, you see between freedom of the will and the kind of work that you're doing is between self-control?
So the old free will debate. So ultimately, if you ask me on my intuitions, what I believe, I'm a pretty hardcore determinist. I definitely don't go as far as libertarianism. I don't think that we have this on the bound free will to do as we wish, that we make our own stories. And I think we're very heavily determined. And so far, I just have had a really hard time wrapping my head around compatibilism. It seems to me to never really work out. I find compatibilists more often than not are people who want to have their cake and eat it too, kind of deal. So so far, I'm pretty hard into the determinist camp. So I don't really believe in the free will. If I can borrow a term from Spinoza, I'd rather refer to it as power of acting.
Right.
So we don't really have free will in the sense of where we could decide to do whatever we want to do, but we have the ability to act more according to our own nature or more being acted upon by things outside of us. Again, if you're familiar at all with Spinoza, he believes that there's no such thing as ultimate freedom. No human being could ever have that. Interestingly, no human being would ever actually want that either, but that's besides the point. So I think our behaviors are very much constrained. I think they're very much constrained by our genetics, our upbringing, our environment, our society, what time the sun shone in through your window this morning, what side of the bed you woke up on. All these little things very much factor into what our behaviors are going to be. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why I keep pushing to emphasize to look at all these other things. Pure willpower, if you will, I don't think it exists. And there's actually this new interesting trend in the self-control literature where a lot of psychologists are hopping on this bandwagon and saying, look, pure willpower doesn't exist. Every time we go out there and we look at people that are successfully self-controlled, that don't fall into temptations, they're people that have avoided temptations altogether, as opposed to ones that fought it head on and were successful with it. So I very much sympathize with that idea. I don't think there's really much to be said about willpower. I think instead, if we want to act certain ways, we need to look at the sorts of factors that make us act in certain ways and manipulate those, as opposed to sitting inside our own heads and trying to manipulate ourselves from the inside. I don't think it will work.
Yeah, so I mean, I wonder why what you said isn't basically compatibilism. So if you're a determinist who thinks that there's still something called power of acting, there can be still control mechanisms, which determined or not, are still internal to you, internal to your nature or something like that, as opposed to external. Isn't that basically a compatibilist position?
Yes, yes. So you could say that maybe even weak compatibilism. The only reason I said before that I don't buy into the compatibilist camp is because even for this claim, I don't have a really good argument for why that's the case. For me, I think you either, the only arguments that as of right now, the way they stand, that I buy the most is the determinist sort of arguments. So I guess there is a part inside of me that wants to carve out a little compatibilism room, give it a little bit of leeway. But I mean, aside from intuition, I have no good argument to back that up right now, which is why I haven't really been talking about it too much in my own work, the more philosophical idea of free will.
Okay, interesting. So, and then finally about this stuff, I wonder what, given what we've just talked about, what do you think the impact of this should have on the criminal justice system? Is there one, do you think?
Yeah, so such a fascinating question. I took this neuro law course in my when I was doing my master's, and my professor, Dr. Nicole Vincent, she does a lot of great work between morality, moral theory, and law and things like that. And she made this very fascinating point. So when we go into the courts, right now, one of the number one defenses that you hear is, I didn't do it, my brain did it, right? My brain made me do it. It wasn't me. I didn't want to do it. So one of the things that she said one day in class that just really still stuck with me, when we describe what goes on in the brain that led to the behavior, are we giving an excuse for that behavior? Are we saying like, look, here's the reasons why it happened, and obviously the person had nothing to do with it because we could detail the brain stuff? Or are you just simply describing what happened in the human being to get into that behavior? And I think that ultimately at the end, all we're doing is describing at all times. Even when it's used as an excuse, you're just describing what goes on. And I mean, ultimately, again, I have to bring Spinoza back into the picture. I mean, he said something very interesting on the matter. He said, look, there's no such thing as free will. We can't control our own actions. If you're going to murder people, you're going to murder people, and nothing can be done about it. If I'm going to adopt 100 puppies, that's what I'm going to do. Nobody could do anything about it, right? It's just the way it is. But we still need to have a legal and court system because most people don't see the world this way. So if you don't go through the motions of the legal system and courts and all that stuff, then, people are just going to go crazy. They're not going to understand, and, all of humanity would collapse on itself. So I have a very similar sort of idea with that. Ultimately, yeah, your brain did it. Your brain is always the one that does it, but you are also your brain. And I think ultimately, I think that the only thing we have a right to do is either punish everybody or excuse everybody. But also I realize that that's no way for our society to function at all. So I think one of the things that we could do is understand better where the behavior comes from. And instead of discriminating on whether your brain did it or you did it, because again, I don't buy that distinction at all. Instead, we need to see what kinds of factors went into your kind of upbringing, and whether those things could have been avoided or whether those things were just part of your life due to negligence. So if I was being raised by horrible parents, but I had the opportunity to run away or move in with an aunt or an uncle or something, I didn't take that opportunity. Maybe some blame could be put there. But if I was born into a bad family, beaten my whole entire life, chewed out and spit through the system, and then I murdered somebody, it's really hard for me to point a finger of blame towards that individual, which is probably why, for good reasons, why I'm not in the court system. Actually, after studying moral theory and human cognition altogether, I find it really, really hard to blame people for anything. But maybe that's why philosophers should not be lawyers. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and so I think that's all very interesting. And even more personally, I think, we as a society blame addicts for their shortcomings. If you were a better person, you wouldn't have had that drink. My family has struggled with alcoholism. My father was the type of person who would cash the paycheck and immediately spend it all, everything at the bar that night. And then we had no money for food, no money for rent. And, society looks at that and says, well, here's a terrible person who succumbed to temptation. But it seems like the kind of view you're pushing suggests that, and I'm sympathetic towards it, by the way, that these are the wrong categories. Of course, there's something blameworthy. What he did was terrible because he wasn't supporting his family, et cetera. But it wasn't a moral shortcoming. It wasn't like he could have done something different and chose not to do it. So that when we take this other kind of view, it certainly may not change the way we implement justice, but it should change the way that society itself assigns blame or praise.
Yes. Yes, no, I absolutely agree with that. And I think a lot of the people that make these sorts of arguments that, oh, you're an alcoholic, my father, beat it after 20 years of alcoholism or whatever. I think those are the kind of people that don't pay attention to the impact that the tiniest little change can have. So, I mean, just to share my own story, I was a high school dropout. I dropped out my first month of high school. I hated it. Did not have a good time there at all. And I worked for many years. I made really good money, especially for somebody my age. And then something clicked in my head 3 years later, and I just got bored. I got bored of my situation. I got bored of being at the same job with the same friends, the same faces. And I just wanted to do something to shake things up. So I decided, let me get my GED. I ended up going to this wonderful GED program where they had wonderful teachers and they were just so welcoming and so warm. And I ended up doing really great on the GED. Decided, let me just take some community college classes. Long story short, almost 10 years later, I'm in a PhD program now. Now, my cousin, he's we're very close. He's like my brother. He's 20 years old now. And right before he graduated high school, he was going through the same thing. He just hated it. He was not having a good time. He was not doing well. He came to me and he said, look, I want to do exactly what you did. I want to drop out. I want to work for a few years. And then I want to go back to school, get my GED, go to college. Everything will be fine exactly how you are. The first thing I said, don't do that. You should not do that at all, because I got incredibly lucky that the circumstances in my life worked out in such a way that this thing happened. If I would have had, say, a boss that was slightly more interesting than he was, maybe if I would have went to work every day, we would have had slightly more interesting conversation. I would have been less bored and not had that, tiny little motivation to go back to school. Even when I went back to school, I signed up. I wanted to be a psychology major because I was always interested in the workings of the human mind. My first semester, I took a philosophy class, Philosophy 101, just because it was the only thing that fit into my schedule. I registered a little late. This one fit nicely into my schedule. It was with Professor Leslie Aarons, who is one of your colleagues. And I still remember it was the first day of class, actually it was the second day of class, and she was talking about this guy Socrates and all his crazy ideas, and I was just so entranced in it. And I was like a wide-eyed kid at a candy store. I fell in love with the subject, never looked back. And from there, the way I describe my academic progression is all literally a matter of luck. As you know, I met you back then, and you were the one that told me to go to Brooklyn College. And I looked up Google Maps directions on how to get there, 2 hour by subway every morning. I went back to you. I said, hey, what about Queens College? And I still remember you said, if you're serious about philosophy, go to Brooklyn College. So I went on that 4 hour a day subway ride to Brooklyn College. There I met another professor, Justin Steinberg. He told me apply to Georgia State. I went to Georgia State. I met Andreas Garantino there. He said, go to Germany, go to Osnabrück. This is your place. So these are all little things that kind of fell into place that pushed me the way I am. If you ask me, am I responsible where I am right now? I say, absolutely not. I'll give you a list of all the professors that nudged me in the way that I had to go. Like, yes, I did all the work in between, but I never made these choices to go into this direction. These choices were made for me. And that's exactly what I told to my cousin. I'm like, look, it seems like the same exact situation on the face of it, but there are tiny little differences, right? You're doing this 10 years later than I am. Maybe there's some sort of different, teacher in the GED program. Maybe the exception process with the community colleges works in a different sort of way. Maybe you're not going to meet this one teacher in this one semester that's going to change your, outlook forever. We really take for granted the little tiny things in the world that make us who we are and make everybody else who they are. And I think it's very important to pay attention to these little tiny differences, because it's the culmination of them that make us who we are more than anything else.
Yeah, luck plays an incredible role.
Absolutely.
And people neglect. I mean, I don't think people have really come to grips with the amount of luck everywhere. Starting going back to Nagel's classic article on this moral luck. It's an incredibly important point, I think. And also, if you're a determinist, I mean, I'm not especially sympathetic to determinism, but that's neither here nor there. But I think if you are a determinist, the point you're making is extremely important. The small causal influences can have a big impact. So simply because things are determined doesn't mean you don't want to intervene in the system, because small changes in the system will make changes in the system. That's what's important. So it's not fatalism. It certainly isn't fatalism.
Yes. I mean, I'm a determinist that still wakes up every single morning and says, I don't like this, I'm going to change this, or I like this, I'm going to continue doing this. I mean, even as a determinism, I'm still out there, maybe blindly, but still thinking that I'm making some sort of change in the world. So you're right, not fatalism.
Yes, I agree. And, I mean, I think you're... thank you for sharing that personal anecdote about your trajectory, because non-traditional students that have dropped out of high school, that go back to community colleges. I mean, that's LaGuardia, where I first met you, that's the purpose of it, or at least that's the purpose that I see for it, is finding people who are non-traditional but have great potential. Certainly, I view you as one of our great success stories. I mean, I think we have a lot of success stories, but I think that you are one of a very nice success story of someone who came in kind of not knowing what they were going to do, found a direction and has pursued it and is on to great things. So it certainly was an honor of mine to have you as a student. I always remember you as one of my best students, one of my most serious students. And so it's really great to see how you've gone on. A little bit bittersweet to see that you've defected from philosophy to cognitive science, but I can't blame you, really, given the picture that you're developing. I think it's important that we have people with your background doing this kind of cognitive work. So it's really great to see that you're flourishing in the true sense of the Aristotelian notion over there in Germany. And I look forward to what you're going to accomplish in the future. I'll be following your publications very carefully. So I don't want to keep you here forever. I'm kind of running out of time. I'm wondering, is there anything that you would like to say that we haven't touched on so far?
Let's see. Well, I mean, just going along with the idea of the commentary that you just made, I think one of the things I really want to push forth, maybe to all your listeners, is the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration. I think that's something that's very important. One of the things that breaks my heart is when I hear philosophers speaking to only philosophers, listening to philosophical podcasts, versus psychologists staying away from the philosophers and, you know, doing their own work, the neuroscientists hiding themselves in the lab, even under other disciplines like historians hiding in their own department and things like that. I think one of the things that really came out in our conversation today is the importance of kind of looking at one topic or one problem from many different disciplines. And that's something that I really want to push, because I mean, in my experience here in Germany, we are all incredibly interdisciplinary. In my research training team that we have here, the only thing that unites us is this idea of situated cognition. Otherwise, we're all very different. I mean, we have neurolinguists working with babies. We have people working with pigeons and monkeys, adult humans. We have people working on spatial orientation and spontaneous metaphors and solving mathematical problems, self-control, moral theory from all over the place. And one of the greatest experiences I've had in the past year and a half is really talking to all these people and seeing all these different points of views and integrating all of that into one viewpoint. And I think that's the only reason why I defected to cognitive science, so to speak, is to have this interdisciplinary sort of environment around me all the time. And actually, the reason why I went to Georgia State is because they had an interdisciplinary major of neurophilosophy, where you got to be around everything. So I guess in the essence of being non-traditional and being very interdisciplinary, no matter what kinds of goals or better judgments you make for yourself in your own life, the important thing is there's not one path to every destination. There's many different things you could do, many different strategies that you could come into play. And I think the whole idea is to just really be very open-minded to it, be very clever in the sorts of way, and be proud of who you are and what you do. I think is the take-home message I want to leave with.
Yes, that's a very nice way of bringing it back at full circle. So I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us. It's been very interesting. I learned a lot from this discussion, and want to just have you hang on for a second. I'll talk to you afterwards. But other than that,
absolutely.
I'll see you later.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was awesome.